Hi, it's me, Jacqueline. Welcome to my channel. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to my channel and join me at Patreon. Link in the description. One morning, a few of days after they were back, Mike rolled over in bed to cuddle with Masumi, and she wasn't there. He sat up in bed, looked around, and no Masumi. The light wasn't on in the bathroom, so she wasn't there. He looked at the clock, and it was only 5. He got up and noticed that her robe was missing. Looking out the window, in the early morning light, he could make out a figure sitting in the garden at their favorite spot. He quickly dressed and made his way to the garden. He stopped and watched her for a few minutes. She was quietly crying. He sat next to her. She turned and looked at him with tears running down her cheeks. He cuddled her close and just held her for a while. Finally, he asked, "Honey, what's wrong?" "Nothing." "Nothing? Then why the tears? And how long have you been sitting here?" "About an hour. I couldn't sleep. Just like me, when I asked you parents' permission to marry you." The tears started again. "What did I say?" asked Mike. "Nothing. It's just." More tears. "Honey, what is it?" "It's that I just want to go back to America as Mrs. Gifford." He hugged her and said, "Honey, I know. I'd love that too. But I don't know if it's possible. We could elope. That wouldn't be fair to our parents. They aren't standing in our way. In fact, I know they support us completely. We just haven't set a date, and we need to give everyone time." "I know, it's not fair. But can't we do something?" Just then they heard footsteps coming towards them from the house. It was Masumi's mother. As she got close to them and said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing, mother," Masumi said, trying to hide her tears. "Daughter, I know you better. Besides, you have been crying." Mike said, "Masumi, tell her what you're feeling." Mrs. Matsushita sat down between the two, and they had a long talk. When all was said, Mrs. Matsushita said, "I think we need to have a family conference and include Mike's parents." The three headed back to the house, and Mr. Matsushita was there having a cup of tea. Mrs. Matsushita filled him in on everything that they had talked about in the garden. And he agreed that they needed to have a talk and include Mike's parents. The four of them went to separate phones, and Mike called home. "Hi, Mom. I'm fine. But we need to talk to you and Dad about something. Can you put him on the extension?" "Well, it's important, and I want to wait until he's on the phone." "Hi, Dad. No, everything is fine. It's that we need to talk to you and Mom about something." "Yes." Masumi and her parents are also on the line, so there are 6 of us on this call. After all the hellos were done, Mike explained what had happened that morning and continued with, "Yes, I know it's very short notice. We had a long talk about it this morning, and the only thing that would stop us is if you guys couldn't be here. We thought the Saturday of the weekend 2 weeks before school starts. Are your passports up to date?" "Great. Okay, see what you can do, and let me know as soon as you can." "No, I would really like Paul and Ruth to be here, too." "Yes, I know it would interrupt their school. But they could use it as a learning experience. We thought that we could do something special for everyone there when we got home." There was more discussion between the Giffords and the Matsushitas. 2 days later, Mike received a call from his parents, and they were able to make the trip, as were his brother and sister. They would arrive on the Wednesday before the ceremony and fly back with Mike and Masumi the weekend after the wedding. The next couple of weeks were crazy with preparation for the ceremony. On the Wednesday before the ceremony, Mike and Masumi went to the airport to pick up Mike's parents. As the Giffords were walking off the plane, Masumi spotted 3 other familiar faces. It was the Gordons. Mike knew they were coming, but kept it as a surprise. And it was a little crowd in the limo on the way back to the house, but Mike's brother and sister sat with the driver. Everyone was staying in the guest house and were met there by the Matsushitas. After everyone had a chance to settle in and freshen up, they went to the house for dinner. Mrs. Matsushita had made arrangements for formal kimonos for the 4 women, Mrs. Gifford, Mrs. Gordon, Ruth, and Jackie, and traditional male kimonos for the 3 men, Mr. Gifford, Mr. Gordon, and Paul. Masumi was going to wear her mother's white wedding kimono, just like Sachiko had, and Mike and Sachiko had gone out earlier and purchased an obi for Mike to present to Masumi. Masumi wore a traditional headdress and makeup, and her hair was also done in a traditional manner. Mike didn't see her until the ceremony started, but when he did, he thought that she looked very pretty. The wedding party was led up to the shrine that was set up in garden just like Sachiko's was by the Shinto priest and 2 shrine maidens. The priest performed the wedding ritual, followed by the couple performing the sansankudo or ceremony of the 3x3 exchange of nuptial cups of sake. Then, Mike and Masumi exchanged wedding rings. Traditional Japanese music was provided by the same musical group that had performed at Sachiko's wedding. After the ceremony, Masumi removed the white kimono and under it she had on a very pretty and ornate red and white kimono. The reception was also held in the garden and there was about 70 people. The newlyweds enjoyed all the attention that they received and finally retired to Masumi's room. As Mike had done at the apartment, he picked Masumi up and carried her across threshold. The only words spoken that night by the newlyweds were, "I love you, Mrs. Gifford," and "I love you, Mr. Gifford." On Sunday morning, the newlyweds slept in until noon. And by the time they came down, the men had gone to play golf and the women had gone shopping. Masumi cooked up some lunch for them, and they decided that since they would be heading back to the States next weekend, that this would be an ideal time to pack up Michelle's things for shipping. And by the time everyone was back, everything was packed and ready to ship. It also looked like they weren't going to make it back to the club before they left. Mr. Matsushita took everyone out to supper and to the theater Sunday night. The play was a traditional kabuki one. And one of the things that the Giffords and Gordons learned about kabuki was that there are no actresses in kabuki. All the female parts are played by male actors. After the theater, they were walking to a local tea house, and Mrs. Gifford was walking with Mike and Masumi. And they were just talking about the play, which everyone had found very interesting. When Mrs. Gifford whispered, "Mike, Mrs. Matsushita said you make a very pretty girl." "Say what?" Mike said, turning very red. "She let it slip that you make a very pretty girl." Mike didn't know what to say. He looked at Masumi, then at his mom. They slowed way down and fell behind the others. Mrs. Gifford continued, "It was while we were shopping. It was entirely by accident, and it was only her and I talking. We were sitting having something to drink, and were talking about the kabuki theater. And she said that all the parts were played by men. And it just slipped out that she had seen you dressed as, I guess it's Michelle. We talked more about it. I told her that I knew that you liked to wear girls' things. And she told me how pretty you are, and that Masumi was very accepting of it." "You knew that I liked girls' things?" "Yes. A son can't hide much from his mother. I found some of your things once. And your sister complained a couple of times about things missing. So, it wasn't hard to put things together. And when Mrs. Matsushita let it slip, I wasn't really surprised. But I was surprised that she had seen you dressed until she told me about Masumi's acceptance of it. And that you had gone out dressed. Does Dad know?" "No. And he won't." "How about Ruthie?" "I don't think so. She's never said anything, but may have an idea. I really don't completely understand this, but I do understand that it's something that's just part of you. And I'm very happy that you found someone that understands you as well as she does." She took Masumi's hand, squeezed it, and kissed her on the cheek. Then gave Mike a hug. Masumi, hanging her head, said, "I'm sorry. I brought Mike out of the closet, so to say. Maybe I shouldn't have." "No, honey. You saw something in him that no one else did. It is part of him, and it appears to make both of you happy. So, enjoy. And maybe someday I might even like to meet Michelle." Masumi hugged Mrs. Gifford, and they hurried to catch up with the others. When they did, Mr. Gifford said, "What was that all about?" "Oh, just a mother, son, daughter-in-law talk." The flight home was uneventful. And Mr. Matsushita had upgraded everyone to first class, so with the 8 of them there was a slight party atmosphere. It was Mike and Masumi's senior year, and classes started shortly after they returned. Masumi had taken an extra class every semester just so that they could graduate together. After the fourth week of classes, the Gordons had made arrangements to hold a reception for the newlyweds. It was going to be held in their backyard, just like Masumi's welcoming party a few short years ago. Masumi had brought her kimonos with her and was wearing the red and white one with the wedding obi. She had spent a long time applying her makeup, which she did in the traditional geisha style. And she had also brought a wig from home that was also done in the traditional style, and when she put that on, she became a very pretty geisha. Mike couldn't get over just how pretty she was. Mike was wearing the same kimono that he had worn at the wedding, and both wore the traditional tabi, split-toed socks, and geta, wooden sandals with raised strips across the sole. There were a lot of people at the reception, which was actually a big barbecue. There were two surprises for the couple. Mike's parents had found a group of Japanese musicians that played traditional music. And Mr. and Mrs. Matsushita, Sachiko, and Jeremiah had flown in. When the couple walked in, it was to a very nice round of applause, and Masumi received many compliments on her kimono and makeup. They spent the afternoon greeting everyone and making small talk. Surprisingly, Kathy Ryder was even there with her girlfriend. She had come out as being a lesbian about 6 months earlier. After the party, Mike and Masumi were on the way home. At a stoplight, Mike looked at her and said, "Calling you Sam right now just doesn't fit. You're just too pretty to be called by a boy's name. And, besides, I just love your name." She looked at him. He couldn't see her blushing through all the makeup and smiled. As she was undressing and removing her makeup, Mike was sitting watching her. Just as she finished, she turned and grinned at him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She stood up, walked over to the bed, let her robe drop to the floor, and standing there completely naked, she bent down, kissed him, and said, "I'm just thinking of how you would look dressed as a geisha." He smiled, shook his head, reached up, grabbed her, pulled her down on the bed, kissed her, and... One thing that Mike found changed when he got back to school was a new dean of the psychology department. It was a Dr. Ruth Halloran. He learned that she wasn't the typical stuffed shirt department head that a lot of college departments have. She insisted that everyone call her Dr. Ruth. In fact, he found that they had missed a really fun party that she had thrown on her appointment. Mike wasn't a psychology major, Masumi was. He was majoring in international relations, but he enjoyed assisting with the experiments in the psych department. It wasn't long after their wedding reception at the Gordons that Mike had a day with no classes, but Masumi did. He had finished all the chores around the apartment and was sitting reading, and he was bored with what he was reading. He started thinking about what Masumi had said. "I'm just thinking of how you would look dressed as a geisha." He went to their bedroom and looked at her kimonos. He was taken as to just how pretty the red and white one was. He took it out of the closet, felt how soft and sensual it was, and laid it on the bed. He then went to the dresser when Masumi had put all the other garments necessary to properly wear a kimono. He had watched her put it on for the party, but just shook his head, figuring that he'd never figure it out by himself. He really wanted to try it. Please subscribe for the next part and visit my Patreon page for early access.